My name is Ingrid Lyons. I'm the executive director of Save the Boundary Waters and its parent organization, Northeastern Minnesotans for Wilderness. What we're going to do and talk about here tonight is basically just go through an overview of what's happening right now at the federal level when it comes to threats to the boundary waters and to the 20-year mining protections that were put in place in 2023 by President Biden and then Interior Secretary Deb Haaland. We'll also talk a little bit about how you can get involved. And if you're here in Minnesota, although I think it's good information for everyone to have, we'll give a little bit of an update on the state of play here in Minnesota. So as a reminder, we love to start with these photos. Jim Brandenburg really helped us bring this issue to life, especially in Washington, D.C. This is one of the pictures we would show to legislators. We do show to legislators. And I think it really just encapsulates what a unique landscape we are all collectively fighting for. So it's important to ground ourselves in place. Um, Save the Boundary Waters is an organization that was founded and focuses exclusively on protecting the Quetico Superior ecosystem. The Quetico Superior ecosystem, as we call it, is comprised of the Superior National Forest, Boundary Waters Canaria Wilderness, Quetico Provincial Park on the Canadian side, and Voyageurs National Park to the northwest. When you consider all of these landscapes together, it's about 4.3 million acres of continuous, interconnected, freshwater boreal ecosystem, which is so rare in this world and vulnerable. Our goal as a coalition and organization is a permanent ban on sulfide or copper mining in the Rainy River watershed, which is basically constitutes the Boundary Waters headwaters, in order to protect all these places. At our core, Save the Boundary Waters is a coalition. So we have more than 425 conservation and hunting fishing organizations, camps and access programs, and business partners within this coalition. We're glad that you're joining us here tonight. We fortunately are joined by one of our primary coalition partners, the Wilderness Society. Allison Flint with the Wilderness Society will help us understand the current threats. But we are so lucky as an organization, as a place, as an effort to be supported by such wonderful powerhouses such as the Wilderness Society and many others. So you get the gift of getting to hear from Allison today. We also have an organization called Kids for the Boundary Waters. It's through this program that we've been able to take hundreds of youth to Washington, D.C., where we teach them how to advocate for public lands and specifically the boundary waters. So if you know a youth, feel free to message Sam in particular on this call. We're always looking for young folks who are interested in learning a bit more about how they can raise their voice for America's public lands. And so we like to, again, ground people in place. Sulfide ore copper mining is a unique threat to northeastern Minnesota, and the mine that we focus on would be located here. This is the confluence of Birch Lake and the South Coishwee River. The horizon line of this photo is the boundary waters. There are hundreds of homes along this waterway, as well as many businesses and camps. Where the circle just floated is where the largest deposit of this four-deposit mine would be. So our primary concern is the way that the water flows in this watershed and where the project would be placed relative to that. Fundamentally, this is the wrong type of ecosystem and the wrong place for this type of mining. This map helps sort of understand why we're so concerned about the flow of water. The squiggly blue line represents the Laurentian Divide. That's what divides the watershed and defines the watershed. Water north of that line flows north. And so that makes this mega copper mining project immediately upstream of the boundary waters, Quetico, Voyageurs National Park, etc. And so you see those different landscapes I identified in the various colors, and the dark sort of water line is actually a hydrogeologically modeled path of pollution. Now, if you remember the first picture I showed you and how deeply interconnected the waters are, this is sort of the most direct pathway that this pollution could possibly take. But it's likely to spread out and would be near impossible, if not completely impossible, to remediate or fix. And so we'll just dive right into the federal update. Again, I'm going to give us some context before I hand it over to Allison. As a reminder, where we stand right now. So right now, there are 20-year protections on the watershed of the boundary waters. In January of 2023, 225,504 acres of jointly managed federal lands and minerals were taken out of the federal mining program through a public land order or a mineral withdrawal. We use some interchangeable terms. It's a public land order, a mineral withdrawal, or a mining ban are the things that we tend to call it. So as of right now, as of today, every square inch of federal lands and minerals in the watershed is off limits to hard rock mining. This was a huge, huge victory in 2023. The coalition had worked really, really hard to get to the point where we could have these 20-year protections in place. And with the ultimate goal of basically codifying this mining ban or mineral withdrawal in law. So taking it from being 20 years, which is the maximum allowable amount of time by statute, and turning it into a law that's passed by Congress to make it permanent. Unfortunately, the 20-year mining ban has been threatened through many different sort of formats, pathways, including at the executive branch and at the legislative branch. We are going to focus on the legislative branch today. Executive level actions were sort of condensed about a year ago, sort of early on in 2025. And we're really going to try to focus on what's going on right now. So the 20-year mining ban that I described, this is the withdrawal map. So when those lands were taken out of the federal mining program, this was the map that was developed by the Forest Service after robust analysis and review. So everything in kind of the golden represents every last square inch of federal lands and minerals that are jointly owned in the or managed in the Boundary Waters watershed. So this is what's off limits to hard rock mining. There have been overarching attempts to overturn these protections, most notably H.R. 978, which is legislation that's been introduced by Representative Pete Stauber. And this legislation would overturn those 2023 protections, the mineral withdrawal, force the issuance of 4 federal mining leases to Twin Metals for 70-year terms. Previously, the lease language of these particular leases had 10-year terms, so just so that you can compare those two. The bill would also force the reinstatement of applications for prospecting permits and bar judicial review. It would also fast track environmental review of a mine plan of operations and also rush permit issuance. So really bad legislation. And although the standalone bill hasn't moved anywhere, these provisions have been attached to a lot of must-pass pieces of legislation yet this year, such as budget reconciliation, NDAA, and the appropriations process. So we continue to look at a lot of different legislative vehicles. And I wouldn't say that this newest one surprised us necessarily, but it sure is a lot to chew on. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Allison to help us understand what this newest threat is. Allison?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Allison Flint. I'm Senior Legal Director with the Wilderness Society. I am based in Bozeman, Montana, but I grew up in Minnesota, going to the Boundary Waters. It's near and dear to my heart. I'm actually taking my daughter back to Ely in a few days for a weekend of dog sledding at Wintergreen Lodge. And I'm looking forward to being back on the Superior. But in my portfolio, I get to manage all of our programmatic legal work, much of our policy work for a big national organization. And I will say, having line of sight on all of the attacks on our federal public lands right now, I mean, Boundary Waters is the tip of the spear on many of these issues in sort of new and unprecedented ways for both legislative and executive overreach that we are trying to defend against right now as best we can. And what we're going to talk about now is really bold and unprecedented, and yet here we are. So next slide. All right, we're going to go into some wonk here. There's a law called the Congressional Review Act. It was passed in 1996, and it was designed at the time to provide a different additional mechanism for congressional oversight of certain types of executive branch or federal agency actions using streamlined provisions. Right, so Congress can at any point in time pass laws through the normal procedures, right? The legislative efforts that Ingrid talked about are examples of those, right? But most of the time, with a few exceptions, those are subject to the filibuster, right? And in this instance, Representative Stauber is having no luck using the normal legislative means. So, um, under the Congressional Review Act, actions that are subject to those streamlined provisions have to be rules as defined by that act. Historically, rules are a very limited subset. They're things that have gone through very specific procedures to called notice and comment rulemaking to become codified regulations in the Code of Federal Regulations, right? For decades, that has been understood by Congress and by all of the executive branch agencies as sort of the world that is subject to the Congressional Review Act. And so for rules, what agencies are required to do when they finalize one of these, right? They have to submit them to Congress and to an entity called the Government Accountability Office, or GAO. And that then triggers a review period of 60 Senate session days. That can be very difficult to calculate and has some weird nuances of its own about how long that actually takes in reality. And then what can happen during that review period is Congress can introduce joint resolutions of disapproval if they disagree with what the executive branch did, right? That aren't subject to the filibuster. So you just need a bare majority in the Senate, but it has to pass both houses of Congress and ultimately be signed by the president. And if a rule is then disapproved by Congress under the CRA, it's like it never happened. It goes away, right? And the kicker is that no rule in substantially the same form can be enacted by the executive branch going forward without Congress taking action. So it's kind of a forever, nope, you can't do that, right? So it really has some teeth, and it is a challenging law for those of us working in conservation and many other areas to be dealing with. All right, next slide. Okay, so up until 2017, the CRA had almost never been used. I don't know, like 15 times or something like that across the whole of the federal government. Did Congress actually enact joint resolutions of disapproval for these type of, notice and comment regulations and say, nope, not doing that. And then we saw at the beginning of the first Trump administration, more of these start to pass, right? But then it kind of tapered off due to some of the nuances of how that 60-day clock works. We were worried in the lead up to the last election that should there be a trifecta government like we have now in Republican control, that the CRA may be used to disapprove Biden administration actions, including in the public lands and conservation space. And we were aware of arguments that have been out there percolating for a while that the CRA ought to be applied to other types of actions beyond those formal notice and comment regulations, right? Nevertheless, up until very, very recently, neither Congress nor the executive branch had interpreted the CRA to apply more broadly to other types of actions. And I think part of why that is rational minds realized that that would have really destructive consequences, right? Like it's very enticing because you can get rid of policies that you don't like, right? On a bare majority vote in the Senate, where you kind of have the government aligned in your favor. But then there's this notion, like if we start applying this everywhere, we're kind of ensuring, there's a little bit of a mutually assured destruction here, right? When the shoe is on the other foot, what we thought was settled, what went through public process, environmental review, right, can just be swept away. And that's the world we're now in, because this Congress and now the executive branch has started to take really unprecedented actions in applying the CRA to new types of federal decisions. So in the last few months, I promise I'm getting back to boundary waters and we'll get out of the deep wonk, they have applied the Congressional Review Act to disapprove a number of federal land management plans that apply to how the Bureau of Land Management manages public lands and resources here in the Powder River Basin in Montana and Wyoming, coal country, right? They've applied that also up in central Alaska to how areas deep in interior Alaska are managed and how they think about the ability for mining versus conservation plays out there. And they have applied the CRA to disapprove oil and gas plans that would provide protections up in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and also the Western Arctic, or what's called the National Petroleum Reserve Alaska. Okay, let's go to the next slide, I think. So what's happening here? So mineral withdrawals are one of those categories of actions, or public land orders or mining bans, those things that Ingrid said were interchangeable, have never been considered rules under the Congressional Review Act. And therefore, the agencies have never submitted them to Congress under the CRA. Now, it is noteworthy that there is a separate, detailed congressional notification process that is required to do these federal mineral withdrawals. And 3 years ago, when then Secretary Haaland and the Biden administration finalized this 20-year mining ban, they followed all of those requirements, right? They submitted a bunch of materials to Congress so that Congress had a chance to take a look and decide if it wanted to pass legislation through the normal means to disapprove of that action. Congress didn't act. What happened last week is that the Interior Department decided for the first time ever to submit the public land order to Congress, again, under this different process, under an explanation that just suggests Congress didn't have enough oversight last time. Code, we want to trigger the CRA's streamlined provisions so we can try to get rid of this, right? So they went ahead and submitted the public land order last week. It was read into the Congressional Record, which is this very wonky thing that then starts that 60-day clock. And what then happened last night is Representative Stauber went ahead and introduced a joint resolution, so a piece of legislation under the CRA that we currently understand will go to the floor of the House next week and then on to the Senate. There are a number of maneuvers that we are discussing, that allies are discussing, including in the Senate, to try to slow this down. But we also need to be clear-eyed that it's on a fast track. And this is the first time the CRA has been applied to this type of action. And it is the first time that the Interior Department or an executive branch agency has just gone ahead and said, we didn't do it right in the past. Now it's a rule. Here you go, Congress. So even for those other actions that I mentioned that were disapproved late in 2025, they used a different workaround process that was much more in the hands of Congress, where they tried to rely on another wonky process using what's called the Government Accountability Office opinion to start the 60-day clock, also sort of a suspect process. But even there, the agencies didn't say, yep, here you go. We failed to submit this, right? So this is unprecedented in a number of ways. Okay, next slide. Okay, so what does this all mean? We are doing all we can to slow this down and stop it. A lot is going to happen in the next couple weeks. Some of it we can predict, some of it's really hard to predict. But if this resolution passes both houses of Congress and is signed by President Trump, they will argue that the implications of that action are that the withdrawal is gone and that no future administration, Secretary of Interior, can effectuate a withdrawal that is substantially the same. Now, adding to the certainty, it's unclear how courts will interpret that requirement that you can't do something substantially the same. So there's layers of uncertainty, in part because the CRA was not meant to apply to these types of actions. So if the withdrawal is removed, right, I think we are expecting and anticipating that will pave the way for the Interior Department to reissue Twin Metals canceled mineral leases, to sort of open things back up to new prospecting, and ultimately to move towards a mine plan that would have to be approved both by the federal government and by the state of Minnesota. So, really devastating implications for the wilderness that we all love so much. I will also say that it has, I mean, again, putting on my hat as um, a professional who and an advocate, not only working to protect the boundary waters, but working much more broadly to protect federal public lands across the country. This has huge implications, right? If this is in many ways what we were fearful of, right? That the executive branch in this administration would just start submitting actions that we thought were settled. Any land management decision is now vulnerable, even if it was made 3 years ago or 30 years ago, which is when the Congressional Review Act was passed, right? Could, in theory, now be submitted to Congress, triggering a new review clock and potentially allowing this Congress to disapprove of that action on a bare majority vote in the Senate, not subject to the filibuster. So it really is opening a Pandora's box. And the implications, which are too geeky to get into here, of sort of the trickle down effects of how destabilizing that will be for different types of land management actions and for all of the public lands and resources that we all own and value, is are sort of too numerous and significant to summarize for purposes of this webinar. So it's a really big deal, and we have a lot of work ahead of us. Okay, I think that was my last slide, wasn't it? And I will now try to look at the Q&A here and
Yeah,
see
sounds
about
good.
starting to answer some of that.
Yeah, I know we have two questions. One about why is it legal to bar judicial review, and the other is, if there's a opportunity to challenge this as an illegal use of the CRA. So I'll let you address those in the Q&A in the chat, and then we can chat about it a little bit later, perhaps in the Q&A.
Yeah, do you want me to try to answer them briefly now? Does that work
Sure,
while we're on
actually, yeah.
it
Yeah.
orally? I think that'd be easier. Um,
Okay.
yeah, so let's see. The first one, sorry, I'm not seeing the same. Why can Congress bar judicial review? That was the first one, right?
Yep. Hmm.
Um, there is no clear answer to that, right? I'm going to give you a lawyer answer. It depends. In many instances, Congress, right, if it works through legislative means, can do what it wants to, right, within constitutional bounds and within separation of powers principles. So there are some instances where Congress has enacted bars on judicial review, right? In order to sue the federal government, you have to have something called a waiver of sovereign immunity. And that's generally up to Congress to make through enacting laws. And so there are scenarios, again, within the bounds of the Constitution, where Congress can impact what is justiciable in federal courts. There are other instances where Congress has gotten slapped down for trying to bar judicial review and sort of trounce on the role of the judiciary under separation of powers principles. So it depends. Um, what are the options for sort of challenging this CRA play? That is also incredibly complicated, and no one really knows because there's been so little use of the CRA. Now we have this unprecedented expansion of the use of the CRA, and there's very little case law out there. Interestingly and troublesomely, there is also a judicial bar in the CRA where Congress said, as part of that 1996 law, compliance with the CRA itself is not subject to judicial review. Now, that is not to say that the agencies don't have to comply with the law and that we could potentially suggest that they're misinterpreting the CRA and their obligations. There's some cases out there, again, a very limited world that says that judicial review bar doesn't preclude looking at constitutional claims, for instance. So all of this is very much in flux. We're going to have to see what Congress does. But a lot of really smart folks are thinking about it. All right. Did I have any other questions I should answer now, Ingrid, or do you want to move on?
I think we're good for right now. Thanks. Yeah, we'll move on. So it's Yes, this is an extremely urgent moment, but I did want to just emphasize that there are folks who are fighting for the boundary waters aside from all of us and all these organizations. There is a proactive boundary waters protection bill that would permanently protect the boundary waters from sulfide or copper mining. This Congress is the first time we've had a bicameral introduction of this legislation. So Senator Tina Smith has the Senate version of this, and Representative Betty McCollum has the House version of this, and both are wonderful champions who will help us through these very challenging moments. And next, I will hand it over to Sam. There's already a question in the chat about the role of the state, so Sam's going to talk a bit about that. And I did also see a question about sort of actions and petitions and whatnot, and we will absolutely be getting to that as well. So I'll hand it over to Sam now.
Thank you. Yeah, we thought we'd briefly talk about our state level work and just how this situation at the federal government makes our work in the state of Minnesota so important. If you're tuning in not from Minnesota, stay with us because it'll be good information for you too, and I'll get into actions that everyone everywhere can take. But just good, even if you're not here, to be aware what the role of the state is. So you can go to the next slide. We are at the Minnesota Capitol regularly this year. The session in the Minnesota legislature starts mid-February, and we have a staff person whose job is to be there every day and work with legislators, be at hearings, doing meetings, and then we have a whole team that works around the year to have constituents in their districts, in their local communities in Minnesota, meeting with state legislators as well. So sometimes that's in their neighborhood, or sometimes they go to the Capitol and set up a meeting during the session. So all of that is important. And if you could find the pictures on the next slide, you could see Amanda testifying in this legislature, which is one important aspect of that. And then on the next slide, just to folks often wonder, okay, if the federal protections go away or are in question, what happens? We have been in a similar situation in the past where, and what might happen is if the company is able to put forward a mine plan of operation, it goes through environmental review, which involves federal and state agencies. And it's important to note that a project like this in Minnesota would have to secure a state permit to mine before moving forward. And when a company submits a mine plan, the state can also conduct its own independent environmental review or choose to do a joint one with federal agencies. The last time we were in this situation, Minnesota chose to do its own independent, robust review, which we think was a good move to really make sure that the state agencies were evaluating everything that perhaps federal agencies weren't. So that's just really important and might be something we're looking at, and why we need to do a few things. Make sure Minnesota's agencies and governor are in the best possible position and encourage them to protect the boundary waters and use our state means to do that. And then in our Minnesota legislature, that we maintain, definitely not weaken, and even strengthen our state laws that protect the boundary waters. So I want to talk about that for a second. You can go to the next slide. One other reason this is really important is because you've heard that 225,000 some acres of federal public land are currently have copper mining banned, but that leaves a lot of state and private land in the same vulnerable landscape and area still vulnerable. And in fact, the mining company recently submitted to our state agency, the Department of Natural Resources in Minnesota, another exploratory drilling plan around the shores of Birch Lake. And we, registered, wrote materials to our state agencies objecting to that and bringing up points that we thought they needed to really take seriously and evaluate. Unfortunately, it was approved. Things like this have been approved in the past because there is this gap where we have federal land protections, but not protections at the state level. And so the company can continue to do some of their exploration activities on state land in that same area. So it's not building a mine, but it is, drill pads, drill sites, which has its own disruptions and is in service of developing their mine plan and their mine. So in the state legislature, we work really hard against rollbacks, as I said, and we do kind of sometimes see those come up, attempts to weaken environmental review and permitting decision and the like in Minnesota. And I want to highlight our proactive work. So just like Ingrid said on the federal level, we have a state permanent protection bill that we need to build support for and pass eventually. So it's got authors in both sides of our legislature. We're building co-sponsor support because, we need a strong state law that bans copper mining in the watershed of the boundary waters as well. So we get all the land protected, not just the federal land. So taking action. Kelsey can help me here with giving you some additional links as I talk these through. So I'm going to talk about the state and then the federal government because, as you heard, things are shifting even today. So if you live in Minnesota, a couple of things. February 3rd is actually the precinct caucuses across Minnesota. So these are the various political parties hold their meetings that are at like a neighborhood level. You can find out where yours is at the Secretary of State website. And then you can use our form to sign up to get information from us. If you'd like to go to your precinct caucus, you can bring a resolution that supports permanent protection for the boundary waters. You could try to move that forward to be adopted by your party's platform. If you want to be a delegate and attend some of the other conventions, you can raise your hand, volunteer, and try to become a delegate. So that's one way to influence folks running for office and various political parties. And we can hook you up with that if you want to sign up in the chat. And then we also on our action page here, so it's our boundary water or our website /action center. It'll take you on a state journey or a federal journey. So go there and you can take a state journey to contact your local representatives if you want. So if you live in Minnesota, maybe you don't know this, but you can learn you have one state senator and one state representative who, is for your community and like your town or your part of the city. And they're accessible. They hold coffee hours. You can actually call or go and meet with them in person, unlike a member of U.S. Congress is usually you're meeting with their staff people. So I encourage you to find out who they are and ask them to protect the boundary waters because it's really important at the state level. And then just today, we've got up and running our national call to action. So we want, now that we think the U.S. Congress is moving towards a vote on this Congressional Review Act resolution, we need you to contact members of Congress across the country and to ask your friends and people you know all across the country to do that as well, so we can reach every office and make sure they know not to pass this bill. I think someone's putting the link for that in the chat. There's two ways we'd encourage you to do that. Calls to their offices are really effective, and they might get hundreds of email messages, and those are good too, but calls where a staffer is actually picking up and the phone's ringing off the hook in their office in DC, or where their mailboxes, their voicemails are filling up, can really make an impact. So we have this neat tool where if you type your phone number and your address in, our service will call you immediately, and then you get some instructions on the phone and it patches you right through. So you can leave messages or talk to the staff people of your three federal office folks, and it'll like tell you who they are and give a little sample of what to say. So please do calls this week. If you call after hours, you probably get in voicemail, but everything's important. And then you can also send a message. So we'll share that as well, and messages into their offices is good too. Like I said, a great time to tell people who care about this in other states, so we can be reaching members of Congress all across the country. So that's what I've got on actions.